In this presentation, we'll talk about writing thesis statements and introductions. Now, as you write your introduction, know the basic purposes. Firstly, you want to hook your reader with a strong attention grabber. And then you want to present your thesis. Now, the traditional placement of the thesis is usually the last sentence in your first paragraph that concludes your introduction. However, keep in mind that your thesis really could go anywhere, and especially if you think about reading articles, the thesis may be numerous different places, so don't always rely on the thesis being that last sentence in the first paragraph. So let's look at the components that a thesis statement must have. First of all, it should focus on a single main point or position about the topic. Don't try to cram too much into your thesis statement, as it may confuse the reader, and also as you're writing, you may experience what I had mentioned before as information overload. Just too many directions will lead to an unorganized essay. It also shouldn't be too broad or too narrow. And this really, I always think of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. It has to be just right. You want to reflect back to how many pages that you need to write for the essay. If it's too broad, you're going to find it overwhelming to write the essay, and you'll find your essay will start drifting off in many different directions. And if it's too narrow, you won't be able to find enough information to connect back to the thesis statement. It has to be specific. And we'll talk more about this later in some examples of some not so great thesis statements. It also has to explain, show, or prove. So keep that in mind. You don't want a sort of book report thesis statement. You want something that really shows your opinion. And once we see the two parts of the thesis statement, you'll see how you can do that. Lastly, you want it to be a forceful statement written in confident, firm language. This means you want to avoid phrases like I believe or I think. In some regards, it is okay to say I think or I believe, and you'll notice in my feedback I say that. Mostly because those phrases are used in particularly when there's something that you want to express that kind of lightens the blow. For example, as I tell you some feedback from your essay, I don't want to be too forceful with it. I want to ease you into my comments. So using I believe is okay in that case. However, in an academic essay, you want to use forceful language. So let's talk about the two parts of the thesis statement now. The first part is a narrowed topic. And the next part is the controlling idea or your perspective of the topic. And as I said before, you want it to have some sort of angle. So let's look at an example. Eating disorders are caused by both cultural and psychological factors. Here, eating disorders is the topic, and caused by both cultural and psychological factors is the controlling idea. It'll be your perspective on the topic. Now let's talk about some common issues that many students have with thesis statements. You may accidentally change the meaning of your main idea. Here's an example. Pets in nursing homes can help residents. This thesis changed the meaning. Everyone should have a pet. Notice, in using the word everyone, you're changing the meaning. Ultimately, you want your main idea to be about residents in nursing homes having pets. So, everyone having pets is a completely different essay. The next issue is asking a question, because it makes your point unclear. Here's an example. Does everybody need a role model? This really doesn't give the angle that you're taking. What if you don't believe everyone should need a role model? Or what if you do? It's unclear to the reader which perspective you are taking. So here's a revised thesis statement. Everybody needs a role model to have healthy influences throughout their life. As you can see, we know the direction the writer plans to take. The next issue is making an announcement, and this also goes back to not using forceful language. Here's an example. In my essay, I will talk about how I adopted my cat. Again, you want to avoid saying in my essay, in my opinion, or I will talk. It just weakens your thesis statement. And also, it forces you to neglect the controlling idea. Notice, all this is saying is the topic, cat adoption. Here's a revised thesis. My cat adoption was an interesting and horrifying experience. Here, as you can see, there's another layer in this thesis statement that will leave the reader wanting to read more. The next issue is writing a fragment. You also, in this case, neglect the controlling idea. In this case, just like the announcement, you may miss a part of your thesis statement. It could be the controlling idea or the topic, but generally, it's something is missing in terms of a part of a thesis statement. So here's an example. A role model that has truly shaped my life. That is a fragment. In this sentence, it's missing a verb. It only has the subject of the sentence. So let's revise it. A role model that has truly shaped my life was my uncle. So now, the reader knows the topic of the essay, the person's uncle. The next issue we'll talk about is if it's too broad or too narrow. Here's an example. The Industrial Revolution was an important time in this country. We all know that the Industrial Revolution changed not only our country, but the world. So I wouldn't recommend this thesis statement. It would be too broad for even a 100-page book. Here's a revised thesis. During the Industrial Revolution, women workers in the textile industry played an important role in Lowell, Massachusetts. So now we have a specific subject matter that we can read about. Specifically, the workers in the textile industry in Lowell, Massachusetts. Now, if it was a longer paper, you could talk about women workers in the textile industry, and not just those in Lowell, Massachusetts. Here's an example of it being too narrow. My family members all have the same middle name. Now, if this is your thesis statement, where are you going to go from here? I mean, a 3-page paper or even a 1-page paper will get boring pretty fast if you just list that middle name. Here's a revised thesis. An interesting event from long ago explains why my family members all have the same middle name. So again, there's another layer to this thesis. You can see that the event will be the topic. A thesis statement can also be too obvious or a factual statement. Again, you don't want it to be a book report. You want it to have some sort of perspective, a new idea, fresh eyes. So here's an obvious thesis statement. Most teenagers drive. Well, most of us already know that, right? And really, this would also be too broad. What are you going to talk about? So here's a revised one. The high accident rates among teen drivers could be reduced with better and more extended driving testing. So now we know the paper's going to be about extending the driving testing for teenagers. Here's an example of a factual statement. A growing number of American children are overweight. Now this is a fact. We have statistics to prove it. A revised version could be written by maybe Michelle Obama. We must, as a nation, act to reduce obesity in our children. Now this would be a great thesis statement for a persuasive essay, one you will have to write in this course.